If we want to shift global systems and get humanity back on a positive trajectory, where do we place our focus and how can we make a difference? I'm Daniel Hartz, and this is the Sustainability Champions podcast, where we highlight the people, ideas, and innovations that are protecting and healing the planet. Today, I'm joined by Jules Hayward, Learning Executive Lead at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Jules has been working in the field of sustainability for over 15 years. And in this episode, we will hear her story about how she navigated her sustainability journey and what she's learned along the way. We'll be covering the importance that narrative and messaging have in mobilizing people and groups, as well as the steps you can take if you're considering a career in sustainability. So really looking forward to hearing this. Jules, thank you so much for joining me today.
That's a pleasure. Pleasure to be here.
And where are you taking this call from?
I am sat on the Isle of Wight at the moment, a seaside town on a small island on the south coast of the UK.
Very nice. Yeah, it's a lovely part of the world. Today, I'd like to discuss really three primary topics. First of all, your career in sustainability, I think is going to be really interesting to hear. From there, the work that you're currently doing at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And finally, any advice you have for people who are considering a career in sustainability. There's so many opportunities and options. So where do you start and really how do you think about it? But briefly, before we go into there, can you just outline what you currently do in the world of sustainability, please?
Sure. So my role at the moment as Executive Learning Lead at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is leading a team who are inspiring and enabling business leaders, active professionals, and young individuals who are learning about the topics related to a circular economy. So we really cover that whole learning continuum from the school age group through into universities and people who are actively in work. We provide them with the necessary stories, the necessary analysis, the necessary information, and communities that they need in order to understand the topic and start to apply it to their daily lives and work.
Wow, that's really cool. And what's the, I know education is a really important piece of having spoken with, quite a number of people who work in the field of sustainability. They always say that education is a crucial aspect to the work that we do. So what is, you're a learning professional or an education professional. What is the role that education has in our movement towards sustainability?
Well, I would sort of simplify that down into how we think creates the world around us. So our habits of thought, our ways of thinking shape our actions, our decisions, and the systems that we create as a species. So one of the fundamental aspects of what we're doing at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is looking at how we can enable people to think on a systems level. So in contrast, if people are thinking in a linear point of view, very sequentially, it's often without looking at the context. So if you're studying a specific subject, like French, for example, but you're not immersed in the culture, you're not immersed in the food, you're not immersed in the people, then it's very difficult for you to, I think, really get a grip of that language.
Yeah, you're learning in a bit of a vacuum.
Yeah. So we always look at how we can enable people to be able to think in terms of systems. So if we look at this drinking vessel, for example, if I was a product designer, I would be looking at this particular product and I'd be thinking, oh, how can I make this as user-friendly for the people who are using it? But from a systems element, how can we enable product designers to not just think of this in terms of the specific product use on a user level, but also think, how does this product fit within a broader system, and how business models that this product sits within of the production of it. And so that is a much more complex set of considerations, and it requires people to think very differently. But it's critical that people like product designers are given the tools and the creative incentives to consider beyond just the individual using of a product like that. And that spans right out into the design of cities and how cities are designed and enabled. So, you know, you can zoom right in to the product, or even to the, you know, the material level, or you need to be able to zoom right out. And I think, you know, humanity has known this for so long. We can see right throughout the stories that have been told in human civilization over the years. As an example, the Bhagavad Gita, the sort of equivalent of the Bible in India, has that element of being able to think on the micro scale and think on the macro scale built into the story of Arjuna and Krishna. Arjuna is this warrior, and he needs to be able to fight on the battlefield, and he needs to be able to engage in the day-to-day turmoils of that battle. But he is also advised by Krishna to be able to stand on the cliff top and be able to perceive the perspective of what is happening. And I think the mental agility to move between the sort of emperor view and the warrior view, if you can use that sort of analogy, is critical. And that is a way of thinking. And educators all over the world, when they're thinking about systems thinking and how we enable systems thinking, are coming up with practical ways of giving individuals and, you know, young people the ability to maintain that agility, to move from the macro to the micro.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I mean, one thing that you said towards the beginning there is you're basically teaching people how to think, and giving, I suppose it sounds like, systems and maybe not so much strategies, but like, yeah, well, I guess it is systems. Like here are ways to think about certain questions and problems. And I imagine, you know, teaching people which questions to ask, because questions are such a powerful tool when it comes to thinking. It also sounds like, in addition to being able to zoom out, I think a really important aspect of this bigger picture thinking is not just being able to see from a very close-up or far away point of view of what's happening now. I would imagine you also need to be able to do the same by looking forward into the future as well. So it's very much both time and space in that sense. And is this the kind of work that you focus on and the team focuses on at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation?
Yeah, I mean, the learning team and the organization is a combination of individuals, many of which who have backgrounds in understanding learning programs and education. And so what we are trying to do is take the science of learning and bring in the understanding of what are the practical challenges that business professionals are facing when it comes to the application of circular economy. So the concept itself, and we can outline that in a moment, of what what do I mean when I'm describing the term circular economy. So there is the understanding of it from a theoretical perspective, but critically there is the how do we create the projects, the conversations, the scenarios to enable people to translate that theory into practice. So that can be through providing content. So we have a huge amount of content on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's website that's publicly accessible. We have learning programs that people can do that give them the sort of the stories and the analysis for them to use. But then also critically, in combination with that, there is the communities. So whether you're coming from a design perspective, so as a designer, how can I interact with other people in my sector to really grapple with the practicalities of this. And I think that community element of it is another critical part of how we create change in the world. We can't just throw stories and analysis at people. We need to give them connections with relevant colleagues and communities in order for them to learn from each other and therefore create more than the sum of their individual parts in terms of change.
Well, that makes sense, and that goes back to the point of view of the individual versus, individual and society, which also correlates very nicely to the point of view of zooming in versus bigger picture. So you mentioned the term circular economy, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is known for the circular economy and for really pushing forward with that. So what exactly is the circular economy?
Well, I think the best way to outline it in a short format context is to say, well, look at our current economic system. Our current economic system in terms of production and consumption is take, make, waste. It's linear. And therefore, it doesn't have the potential to function in the long term. And we know this because of finite resources, but we also know this because of the huge instability that those resources provide organizations with in terms of the fluctuation of those vital materials that they're using for production and consumption. So the current model, I think it's pretty indisputable that that isn't fit for purpose in terms of, global civilization. So what is the proposal? What's the alternative? And from a very conceptual level, the alternative is that we create a system that is regenerative, restorative by design, so that it has the ability to restore and regenerate itself through the cycling of materials. And a circular economy can really be summarized when we look at the three principles around it. So how can we design out waste and pollution? So that is the design challenge. It's why we have a huge emphasis on enabling designers to use this. So designing out waste and materials is critical, and that really draws in on the school of thought that underpins the circular economy around cradle to cradle. And if people haven't heard that term, they should absolutely look into the work of Michael Braungart and William McDonough, and how they have created this clear distinction between biological and technical materials, and how those can cycle in their own systems, and how they can play that regenerative and restorative role distinctly. So there's the designing out waste and pollution, drawing from that cradle to cradle school of thought. There's keeping productions and keeping products and materials in use. So that's extending the product life, or indeed if a product has a single-use short-term life cycle, it's designed for that. So obviously single-use plastics is a very kind of common area at the moment that's been highlighted as an issue, primarily because from a structural point of view and from a material point of view, these this packaging or these products are not designed for single use. But then if we do want to extend the product life, make it more durable so that the embedded energy and materials within that product can be utilized again and again, so multiple use cycles, that is a really key piece, and that principle really draws from the work of Walter Starhill and the performance economy. Again, a brilliant thinker who's worth looking into. He's published a number of books around the performance economy, and he really brings in the business model elements of how do we create these effective production and consumption models, both on a small and large scale. And then finally, regenerate natural systems, the third principle of the circular economy. So if we're going to regenerate the natural systems that underpin our economic activity, then how do we do that? And, I'm sat here looking out. I'm lucky enough to have a view of oak trees and, various different beautiful shrubs and so on. All of those organisms have developed over millennia because of the resilience that they operate in as an ecosystem. How much research and development sits within these resilient systems that we can draw from when it comes to restoring and regenerating the systems around us. And that really draws from the work of biomimicry and Janine Benyus, as well as others, of how do we take insights from living systems in order to make our economic activity not just sustainable, but to move into that more aspirational point of view to regenerate. Because to sustain is, in my opinion, limited. If I was to describe my marriage as sustainable, I don't think you would feel that I was in a particularly loving relationship. It's not aspirational. So why can't we inspire the necessary human ingenuity by pushing our aspiration beyond sustain and into that realm of regenerate and restore? And so that's really that third principle. And everything sort of moves around that in terms of the application of the circular economy when it comes to policy making, when it comes to business strategy, when it comes to how we enable people to think differently and learn in new ways. All of that work that is done at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is done in the context of those three principles and using them as a heuristic to move around.
Yeah, I think those three are very cool, and I think you're absolutely right. You're not the first person to mention about the term sustainability as not being quite accurate in terms of what we should be aiming for, or rather, not using the word should, but rather must. We can't just, if we're sustainable, then basically we just need to find a way to keep what we're doing now working for as long as we can, whereas regenerating and really moving forward would mean that we need to completely change our systems because otherwise we're just going to stay where we are now, and that just doesn't really work. And I agree with you. I think it sounds like to me the circular economy, and this is what I was thinking when you first mentioned kind of the difference between linear and circular, is it really does imitate nature, and you mentioned that with that term biomimicry. I guess the challenge is we have so many different types of technologies. We're taking this call on a computer. I have a microphone here. There's a lot of things that are required that come from all over the world. So how do you keep all of the considerations of the fact that people aren't willing to give up all the technological advances that we've made and the comforts that we're used to? And ultimately, sometimes, you just go out and it's not practical or you forget your reusable water bottle. How do we make sure that, it's still easy for people to live a good life without the environmental negatives that come along with, for instance, getting a takeaway or buying a plastic bottle of water, which in the case of single-use plastic is a big concern, I think.
Mm. I think we need to really think very, very strategically about where we're placing our emphasis. There is so many behaviors that we can, as a species, I say there are so many behaviors that we can focus on changing right now. The next 100 years of human activity will dictate whether we're able to move into the next 1,000, 2,000 years of human civilization, or in fact self-implode because of the bad choices that we are making. And so where do we place our emphasis, I think is key. And where are we tying ourselves up in knots on seemingly areas that have low impact? And where can we actually move so that we are having exponential impact? And I think that is a really, really difficult question. And it's one that we are continuously asking ourselves as a team at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, because anyone who's working in the area of global change and you know, systemic impact is always looking for where are those acupuncture points that we can trigger. And so I would put the challenge onto your listeners to really consider what it is that they're putting emphasis on, and are there choices, the choices that are going to make the difference. Because if we're going to tie ourselves up with choices that are really quite surface level and, you know, minuscule in comparison to where the negative impact is occurring, then, you know, we are not going to be able to mobilize massive change. So I think it's really, you know, for those who are wanting to go into this field, critical to really consider, so, you know, where are my skill sets? Where are my passions? And where are the challenges? And a sort of, almost like a sort of culmination of those things, because those are very individual. Your strengths, skills, passions, values, and your considerations of where the issues lie, Daniel, are distinctive from mine. And so we can all come at this from a different personal, individual point of view. And I think the personalization of this is critical. There's not a one size fits all journey around this. My journey into this topic was a journey that took me from the area of designing green spaces at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, right into a completely different field. I worked at Kew Gardens for 5 years, and I was designing displays for the public to enable them to understand topics around about conservation and biodiversity. Really great job. I loved it. It was an amazing institution to work within, but I realized that my work was limited. The impact that I was having was really surface level in my point of view. And I was becoming increasingly aware of global issues. And I felt very uncomfortable. You know, in myself, I felt like I wasn't fulfilling my potential in contributing to the change that I felt was so critical. And so I stepped off a bit of a precipice. I quit my job. I applied for a master's in leadership for sustainable development, which was run by a fantastic organization based in London called Forum for the Future. And I managed to get onto the course, gratefully, which was also just a bit of a crossroads for me, because I quit my job before I'd even got on. And I did the year's master's, which I have to say was, I think, an exceptionally well structured learning experience in terms of how they set up that course, because it combined a whole realm of different learning experiences as well as very immersive experiences into multiple sectors, so that you understand policy, so that you understand media, so that you understand what it means in business. And so to get that multifaceted point of view was really critical. Coming out of that course, and as I started to transition into thinking about my work, instead of feeling clear in terms of my trajectory, I actually felt a real sense of, I felt lost in terms of how I could have an impact. The course had given me an overwhelming amount of information in terms of global issues. And I think for anyone now, if you're interested in what's going on in the world, environmentally, socially, or economically, you know, there's an aspect of being terrified at the prospects of these systems around us. And I was lost in terms of how can I have any impact on these huge, complex global issues. And I felt very paralyzed in terms of where to go next. And that, you know, that was I remember it was a couple of months period of feeling really, really lost and quite disenchanted with where I was at. And at that point, I had elected to do a local government placement here on the Isle of Wight, which is where I grew up. And I discovered the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And for me, it was a distinctive narrative that was coming out, because it was a positive trajectory. The language that was used, the framework itself was aspirational. It was about, how do we get from here, which is not where we need to be globally and societally, to a place that is better, that is exciting. And I think that distinction around creative energy is absolutely critical now. Right now, we need human ingenuity to be ignited on a unprecedented scale. And that journey that I went on, in terms of that connection that was made for me, I think many people are all over the world are experiencing, and we can see this statistically as well. We can see this shift into what I would describe as purpose-driven career paths. Individuals are seeking careers which align with their personal values, and also utilize their personal skill sets. And this third piece that I'm suggesting they bring in is, okay, so these are my skills. If these are my values, how can I have most impact? And to really sit with that question, because it's not an easy question to answer. And it depends what country you're in. It depends what social economic position you're in within that community. It depends on your connections. There are so many different aspects that are either opportunities or limitations for people all over the world. And all of those considerations need to be made as we work out our own individual trajectory into creating change in the world.
Would you say there is a wrong answer to that potentially?
Well, I mean, I maybe wouldn't frame it like that, but I think, well, actually, I will be stronger than that. I would say yes. I would say that if people are gonna miss the opportunity to look at that systemic element. So for me, the wrong answer is looking at small scale, what could be described as low impact activities. We absolutely have to be thinking really, really carefully about the most kind of critical points of intervention. And in order to do that, in order to assess where are these points of intervention, where are these critical areas, systems thinking and the whole body of work that sits around it knows that you must understand the system and you must map the system. So one of the first things to do for an individual is to map. So what is the system? So for example, I am a city planner. I've just come out of my my degree in urban planning. I'm passionate about communities, for example, and creating coherent communities and enabling communities to thrive. So just as an example, okay, so if I'm passionate about communities and enabling communities to thrive and be diverse and so on, and I'm a city planner, how can I have most impact in the world, and how can that play a role in this trajectory of change that I feel is necessary? So, where do I live? What are my options in terms of where I can move to? What are the different organizations that are working in this area? Who is having exponential impact in this space? Who are the leaders? Why are they the leaders? What are they doing that's making them so effective? And so asking all of these questions and beginning to understand that particular system and context is what all of us who are wanting to go into this field need to be doing asking ourselves really, really hard questions in order to get to a position where we're actually having the most impact that we can possibly have.
Play a little bit of devil's advocate, and maybe just or maybe it's just a clarification. I'm just thinking of, just an alternative, I suppose, way to look at it, from the point of view of the phrase "act locally, think globally." Is it possible to do something that has a lot of impact, which is still quite hyper local? I mean, I'm thinking of, maybe someone who decides to be a regenerative farmer, for instance. Farming is crucial. We all have to eat, and I think agriculture has a huge role to play in our movement towards a more regenerative or sustainable lifestyle. It seems like, and I'm not picking on farmers, it's just the first one that comes to mind. I'm sure there's other examples as well. It's just, if I'm a farmer, in my view, at least, I'm kind of just focusing on my plot of land, and I want to be regenerative, so I'm not using any pesticides, et cetera, et cetera.
Daniel, there's, if I can give a couple of different, larger scale example, Leontido Balbo, based near Sao Paulo in Brazil, had his own sugar cane production farm, and he spent 7 years trialing and testing new production methods that were not just organic, but were regenerative and restorative. He built in biodiversity corridors across his farm. He changed the machinery that he was using so that it wasn't compacting the soil, so that the mycelium under the soil is what he describes as the internet of the soil, these communication structures of fungi which enable plants to identify where the nutrients are and create a whole necessary connectivity at that substrate level. So he was a complete systems thinker, and he spent 7 years taking the organization into debt in order to trial and test these concepts. And it was only actually because it was a family-run business that he was able to do this. CEOs very often aren't able to make these sorts of operational diversions because they're legally obliged to provide shareholder value, which is another sticking point in this whole aspect. But he was able to prove this over a 7-year period, and is now much higher yields, 40% higher yields than he was at previously. And he has a completely organic, all biocontrol based food production, but it's at scale. He provides over 30% of the organic sugar globally. So he has been able to take his organization to change the operations of that farm and scale it. Having said that, it's not all about going big. If you are a small farmer and you want to stay small, there is ways in which you can scale your impact through, for example, you can connect with other small-scale farmers and collectively create systems of, that sort of industrial ecology element of how can we share different byproducts in order to create that regenerative, restorative. And there's many examples of that within the farming community, that one person's waste is another person's food, and it's just about creating the cost-effective logistics to move stuff around. And that's an example of where policy plays a key role, why the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has a fundamental role in policy and the work of governments and cities to enable that sort of transportation of materials so that it is cost effective. So small scale farmers can still get into that scaling point through things like creating ecosystems of material cycles, or for example, they can promote their story and inspire many others. And I think that's another thing.
That's what I was going to say.
That we, your podcast is an example, and there's many different amplifiers of these stories to inspire and enable.
Yeah, I think that exactly the point of view of just, I'm thinking I've had a couple of farmers speak on the podcast, and a big part of what they do, because many of them are in the Midwest of the U.S., where traditionally, everyone there is doing just the very standard, as they call it, conventional farming. So you have your big tractors, all your sprays, et cetera, et cetera. And you have these farmers who just like say, I'm not interested in that. I'm not going to play that game. And in the middle of of this farmland, which is, hundreds, if not thousands of miles wide, it's just this little regenerative farm right in the middle of it. And their yields, like you say, go up dramatically. And they're just showing, we can do this differently. And oftentimes it's actually less expensive. We don't rely on anyone else for subsidies, whether it's governments or companies, because we're self-sustaining, and we're regenerative. And then other people see it and they say, well, how did you do that? And that is the power of, going back to, answering my own question of being one person making a little difference locally. That is the power, because even if it may not be local to them, there are people there's a farmer in Virginia, his name is Jules Hayward, and he opens his farm. I would love to have him on the show, because he's been doing this for a very long time, and he opens his farm up all the time, and people just visit, and he shows them around. And that's a big component of what he does, is just educating, and people fly from all over the country and probably the world to see how he does it. And I think that comes back to exactly what you're doing, which is education. There's a really interesting question about that I think we talked about previously, before we were recording, about this idea of creating massive change. And it's probably a really big question. I think you've touched on it here and there, but I'd like to just ask the question very point blank in terms of how do we create massive change? You said when you took this Forum for the Future class, there's or course rather, there's this element of fear, and you realize we really need to act, and simultaneously we have to I think we have to be optimistic and positive about it, or else it becomes very difficult to actually to make those choices and to act. So how, with so many challenges that we're facing, how can we create massive change around the world? And it sounds like we need to do it quickly.
Mm. Well, I think it depends on who you are, to start with. So, we all play a different role in that, organizations and individuals. And I think from a one of the key pieces around this is how do we mobilize individuals and organizations, because this is what we need to be doing more. Is there's a sort of almost threshold that's been reached in terms of the low-hanging fruit of people who are kind of attuned to global issues and are on board with trying to create change. So how do we enable all of those people who are not attuned to this agenda? And I think we need to give them the ability to make the decisions that they need to make in order to shift systems. So, for example, I think that it's critical that we give business leaders the economic rationale for making a change. I think responsibility and moral compass is really not giving business leaders the tools that they require to shift business operations. As I mentioned earlier, from a CEO point of view, there is a legal obligation to provide shareholder value, and then all right down through the incentives chain of management, everything is unless you're a social enterprise or a B Corp, you are very often highly profit orientated on short-term incentive cycles. And so that whole system is locked into that existing mode of operation. So we have to be able to articulate what is the alternative and how is this economically viable for your business. And that is a huge amount of the work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has done with other organizations such as McKinsey, to provide that analysis and to spell that out and things like the Circular Economy 100, which is a business-led community, which looks at creating small and large business connections so that organizations can cluster around specific sectors and create change. So there's that piece of economic rationale, which I think is really key. I also feel like the term sustainability is so broad, and as I mentioned earlier, in terms of its actual makeup as a word, is pretty uninspirational to sustain. So how can we use words and language that actually triggers people's intrinsic motivation, so their own personal drive? And I feel like that is done by using words that are aspirational, that are positive trajectories for people to strive towards, rather than shame-based messaging, which I think a lot of the sustainability agenda has been very guilty of. That guilt-based message is what I was experiencing when I got through a whole realm of that course, was that there is so much guilt.
Yeah.
And that shame that sits around that emotionally, for me, I felt the impact of that. And I know how much other people are feeling the impact of that. And a lot of those people just shut it out, and they're just like, look, I'm just going to crack on and just not look at that, because it's hard to look at it, because it is complex and it is scary. So I think we need to be really, really careful about how we bring people into this agenda, and use words and use messaging and use stories that inspire. So yeah. And
with people listening to this, and just, I'm an individual. I don't work for the government. I am asking myself, and I have been for a long time, what are the biggest, as you call them, acupuncture points? I kind of like to think of them as levers or pulleys, or like, the Pareto principle, 80-20 rule. What's the most effective space that I, as an individual, can focus on to make the biggest impact? So, it's an important question to ask. Are there any kind of tips or tricks or hacks, or I don't know what other words we can use? I suppose the question is how can we more effectively think about this? You're absolutely right. Sustainability is a broad term, which on one hand is really exciting. It means that there's so many opportunities. On the other hand, there is the classic analysis paralysis. There are so many opportunities. It's the paradox of choice. You don't even know which one to go for. There's 5,000 million flavors. 5,000 million isn't even a number, and it still feels like there's just so many. So, how can we think about what we as individuals can do to actually make a difference? What are some of those areas that you can start with, kind of like right now?
Well, from a psychology point of view, we know that intrinsic motivation is critical, because ultimately we need people to be very motivated, because this is a very hard topic and it's a very hard area of work. It's changing on a daily basis, and the problems themselves are extremely sticky. So we need to have a huge amount of motivation to learn about it, to apply it, to get through all of those barriers. So I think intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic. So asking yourself, why am I doing this? What is my driver around this? And really, really digging into that on a personal point of view, and whether that's sitting down in a quiet space and going through that as a personal practice, to really dig into what are my core motivations around this. Because I think we need to, from a psychological perspective, really get into that deep sense of motivation and desire, in order to then be able to move into that space of, I am highly motivated and I am highly driven, in order to go into this trajectory. And with that motivation will come a clarity of trajectory. So I think that would be my advice for people, is to actually take the time to dig into it, in order to trigger your own personal intrinsic motivation around the topic. I think that's key. I also think, you know, be careful what you read and where your sources are. So if you're going into a space that is actually, you know, making you feel crap, you know, making you feel shameful, making you feel guilty, if you're reading a specific feed, or if you're, you know, interacting with a specific individual who's actually, the messaging is not inspiring you, then just stop it. You know, just find those sources that are inspirational and that really chime in for you, and inspire you. So I think, you know, where we're getting our information from and what information we allow into ourselves, then that is also a really important point. So, you know, on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website, there is, you know, there's a whole realm of different resources that are available for individuals who are at this point of trying to, I want to join a community. Well, there's the design community, or there's the teaching and learning community, or there's the general, what is the circular economy community, or I want to learn about this topic. So there is, you know, we can break the topic down into what this mean for food, what does it mean for plastics, what does it mean for fashion. So find your entry point into this, you know, and find your tribe, find, you know, people around you who are interested in that particular area, whether it's circular economy or another aspect of the, you know, broader change agenda. So I think, you know, your sources are key, your motivation is key, and find some people who inspire you. You know, find some individuals who really help you to see where you want to be going.
Yeah, I think it sounds to me that the kind of the message here is to, you know, there are a lot of issues. Many of them are very urgent. I think it doesn't mean that you have to rush into it and just start flailing around as quickly as possible, because that's not necessarily effective either. Speed, speed without clarity of direction doesn't actually get you anywhere in particular. So to me, I think the main message that I'm getting from what you're saying is, you know, it's okay to take a few months or even maybe a year to really think about it and research, take your time, find something that inspires you, and understand. You called it intrinsic motivation. You know, the way I like to think about it is my why. You know, why am I doing this? If I do this, what will my life look like? And how awesome will my life be? If I do this, how terrible will my life be if I choose not to do this? You know, and really create that fire inside in order to move forward, so that kind of no matter what comes your way, you're always willing to push past those barriers. Because challenges always come up, and if you know exactly why you're doing it, if you have that intrinsic motivation, you realize, you know what, this is worth fighting for because, and you have your list, it makes it much easier. And that work, it's internal work. It takes time, and sometimes if you're not used to it, it can be a little scary. And I think it requires maybe a notebook or a long walk, or recording yourself talking, as you mentioned previously when we spoke, Jules. This got very deep, but I think it's very important. You have to know kind of who you are and why you want to do this. I don't think it needs to be that scary. Sometimes it's just like, you know, for me, I love planting trees. I don't know why. I just absolutely love it. I think it's so important. And to me, that's where I would love to contribute the most. I would love to plant billions of trees around the world. So I'll just focus on that. And I think there's going to be other people who realize trees are important. For them, their motivation is getting plastic out of the ocean. And that's fantastic, because I'd rather focus on planting trees. I know plastic is important to get it out of the ocean, but there's other people who will do it better.
We can't do it all, I think, is you know, a good point you're making there. And that's when we get overwhelmed, actually, is when we try and take it all on. That's where I got at the end of the course, is I felt overwhelmed by all the different options. So I think that piece of actually really trying to hone in on a specific area is critical.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And I'm just conscious of time here. One question I love to ask is, who do you admire in the field of sustainability?
Well, I mean, I've been lucky enough to work with some incredibly capable individuals. I think the person who really stands out and who has been an absolute honor to work with from the outset is Ellen MacArthur. She was an ocean racer. She broke the round the world single solo racing record, and she did that because of the very unique strength of motivation that she operates on a daily basis. So this, this whole conversation actually winds back in really nicely to how Ellen functions. She is somebody who sets herself very clear goals. She takes time to understand what those goals are, but she sets very clear goals, and then she absolutely methodically works towards achieving them. And right from founding the foundation in September 2010, very close to the last economic downturn, very difficult time to set up a charity, right through to now. I've been working there for 9 years now. There's over 150 staff members from when I joined, when there was about 8 of us. So we have grown as an organization, and I think Ellen's leadership she believes the incredible is possible. She truly does. She's somebody who, one of the quotes from her book, Full Circle, is, "Goals are dreams with deadlines." And I think that summarizes really nicely for her. Is she is a dreamer. She dreams big. The incredible is possible. But then she gets these big dreams and she brings them absolutely into reality. And she applies herself with complete dedication to that. And it's very inspiring being around her on a personal level, but also on a professional level. So she's somebody who I've been very privileged to get to work with.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think, it's reading her story is really both inspiring, and I would say, I think there's a lot of practical elements, as you mentioned, that you can take from there. So if people want to learn more about either the work that you do, or you're currently at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, so if they want to learn about the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where's the best place for people to find you and really to learn more?
Yeah, I mean, today we've been having this conversation with me as an individual, as somebody who's in the broad field of sustainability. I'm currently actually on maternity leave, so I'm not actually actively at work at the moment. But I can say anyone listening to this podcast can, if you're wanting to learn more about the topic or the foundation's work, ellenmacarthurfoundation.org, and the website is pretty user-friendly in terms of diving into the different elements that your listeners might be interested in, whether it's learning more about the topic, or whether it's about our business communities, our work with governments and cities, and so on. So I'd signpost people towards that work. I also mentioned Forum for the Future. It's really a great organization that I was very glad to interact with over that year's masters. They do exceptional work in systems level change. And yeah, those would be two touch points.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jules. It was really great speaking with you, and love the work you're doing, and love the way you're thinking about the work that you're doing as well. So thank you so much.
Daniel. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, give us a 5-star rating. And also, please subscribe, whether on your podcast app or on YouTube. And that way you can be the first to know about new episodes. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon.